Fantastic. Good morning.
I know.
Always nice to see a full house. Well, first of all, let me thank again, as I always do, the organizers of Art Basel. It's truly an enlightened thing to add these stimulating conversations to the fair. And let me thank our wonderful panelists today. We have truly a fantastic panel. They're seated in the order that you see them there, but very quickly, Margarita Aguilar of the Museo del Barrio, Thelma Golden of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Madeleine Grynsztejn of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and Beatrix of the Kunsthalle in Zurich. Please give them a hand in advance for their contributions. So it's been 10 years, which is, by the way, incredible, isn't it? How many people were at every single fair? Right, that's incredible. Hello. So 10 years in, it's quite natural, I think, to think about the concept of evolution. And each year when there's a conversation leading up to what should be the conversations, we think about what would be a good theme. So evolution sort of came naturally because of this anniversary, and so we thought, let's talk about in this museum panel about the evolution of museum missions. Now, admittedly, that is a wide open topic, and as we talked with the panelists ahead of the event, several of them said, well, how could we narrow this down a little bit? So two things about that. First of all, we're mainly going to be talking about contemporary art museums, given the nature of the fair, but I'd like to think that the problems or issues or challenges and opportunities of contemporary art museums are interesting and applicable to museums of all kinds. And to some extent, I think that the issues that they face often throw into sharper relief the issues that all museums have to face because of the nature of the subject matter, the fact that the work itself isn't necessarily historically resolved or put in its place yet. So it's always interesting to talk about contemporary art museums. Secondly, in terms of what I think might be the ultimate point of this conversation, I think it's really about the question of how do we keep museums as relevant, essential parts of our sort of cultural landscape and our public life. And that's not a small issue. We take it for granted that museums are absolutely at the heart of our culture. But, and it has in fact been an extraordinarily great 150 or 200 years for museums. It's had a great run, and things are sort of looking good. Attendance is relatively strong, especially if you compare it to some other so-called high art forms. Museums are putting up shiny buildings. It looks like people are even willing to support museums. But I'd like to put it to you that although these institutions are sort of emblems of their communities, are sort of great sort of secular communing venues, it's not guaranteed this position at the heart of the culture. Yes, we are sort of the public square, but we will continue to be that. And what is it that museums need to do to evolve with the times? And I think in other panels, if you've been here before, you've heard me say there's been more change in the last 10 years than in the last 100 years. And the change is accelerating. And museums can't sit still. They have to constantly think about how to sharpen or broaden their agendas. And that's, I think, what this conversation is about, because we don't want to get left behind. So how do we get from high principles to clear goals? What should be the most important goals for museums today? What are the great opportunities? What are the obstacles that stand in your way? Those will be some of the questions we'll talk about today. There's a famous classic essay on museums by Philip and Neil Kotler called "Can Museums Be All Things to All People?" Anybody who had studied about museums, I'm sure, has read this essay. The answer, no, they can't be all things to all people. And they can't possibly be, because they're always trying to balance ever broader mandates with always finite resources. So tough decisions have to be made. And the people who make those tough decisions are the museum directors and their board chairs and their boards. But this is what the wonderful colleagues here get paid to do, is to make those very difficult calls. And I'm glad to say I think we could hardly have a more enterprising and fearless group of museum directors here than we do this morning. So I think this should be a very enlightening conversation. What I'm going to do is, at the beginning, I'll ask each one, just to sort of get into it, what is sort of top of mind for them when it comes to thinking about the evolution of their own institutions' mandates and about museums in general. And then I'm going to I'm going to read for each one their mission statement. Mission statements are an art form unto their own, as you may have seen. So we'll read our mission statements. And by the way, I wonder if you asked your staff members, do you believe that they would be able to recite your mission statement?
We make them do it every day.
Yeah. That's how you start every morning. That's right.
She probably does.
Exactly right.
To him.
So that's what we're going to do, and then that should probably get a few issues out on the table, and then we'll talk. But very much in the spirit of making things accessible, we certainly would like to encourage the audience to also share their questions, which there'll be time for at the end. And then we can all go back to enjoying the fair. So I'm going to start with Margarita Aguilar. Mm-hmm. And the reason, of course, is that you are the newest and freshest in your role. I'm not sure if you unpacked your office quite yet, because you started in September.
It's getting messy.
It's getting messy. That's a good sign. And so you obviously must be thinking quite a lot about the evolution of the mission of your institution. Just a few words about Margarita. She has been there since September. This is her second run at the museum. You were curator at the Museo del Barrio.
But I started as an intern.
What?
I started as an intern at El Museo.
As so many great museum directors do. So you were there for about a decade as a curator and a major expert in Latin American art, especially photography. And then she sort of went over to the dark side. She was at Christie's as a specialist and a vice president in their Latin American department, and then came back to the museum. And she comes to the museum at a really wonderful moment in the history of this 40-year-old institution. If you haven't been that far up Fifth Avenue on your recent visits to New York, please go there, because they're astonishing new buildings, really quite wonderful, and a very active new program, including a vast new project on Caribbean art, which you're also partly collaborating with Thelma. So here is your mission statement, which you didn't write. No. It's to present and preserve the art and culture of Puerto Ricans and all Latin Americans in the U.S. through its extensive collections, varied exhibitions, publications, bilingual public programs, educational activities, festivals, special events. Museo educates its diverse public in the richness of Caribbean and Latin American arts and cultural history. It still goes. By introducing young people to this cultural heritage, the museum is creating the next generation of museum goers while satisfying the growing interest in Caribbean and Latin American art of a broad national and international audience. Mm-hmm. So, as you think about how your institution needs to evolve, and indeed all museums need to evolve, what is your guiding concern?
The reason I came back to El Museo when I was asked that question is because of that mission and because of the vision this museum has had clearly from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And that is done with the staff that we have, a curatorial team, an education team that really gets the picture of what is important. And at the bottom of it, it's really serving a group of artists and and actually a history that has not been focused for many years, obviously. And the museum grew, as you know, out of the struggles of the 1960s. And that story is still being told in many ways. The Caribbean project that we are doing, an undertaking with two important sister institutions in New York, is actually just another form of expanding our mission, of including people that really don't make it to the table sometimes. And we're, for the first time, looking at a region, the Caribbean, that has never really been a focus of Latin American studies, of the history of Latin American art. It's always the history of Latin American art and the Caribbean as an afterthought. We're looking at this body of sea, not a land mass. We're looking at this body of sea that is inhabited by these islands that have very distinct cultures, but they are united in the fact that they are sea guided peoples and obviously nations. And that for us is really carrying the mission even a step further. This is going to include the art of the Caribbean, the entire Caribbean. It's going to include the Spanish-speaking, the Dutch-speaking, the French-speaking, and the Dutch Caribbean. How much more inclusive can that mission be? This is exactly the point that that mission is the guiding force for what we do. Mm-hmm. This is a grand project, and I'm very happy to show it off because it is great scholarship. It is what guides the mission. The mission is really about scholarship, about representation. And the Caribbean is just another fruition, another expansion of what we can do when we have a mission that really guides everything.
Now, of course, you have this great, fortunate situation of having this tremendous focus. Although I guess it's one of those things that as you get closer to the forest, it's a little harder to define that focus. I mean, usually these boundaries keep shifting as they are defined. How do you deal with that negotiation?
One of the interesting things, and we have it in the history that we actually have on our website, and we've always gone back to the history of El Museo. We've done publications on the voices and visiones at El Museo, and we've always looked at the mission and how we can best serve that mission. I know in the beginning, the mission has been looked at since 1994 several times, how best we can expand it. And you've seen not different versions, but much more other perhaps ideals related to the mission. And the mission is about serving not only the legacy of the founding fathers, but also what constitutes El Barrio, which is part of the name of the institution.
So for you, it boils down to this idea of the voice.
The voice, exactly. And it is also, tied into everything we do, not just exhibitions and programs, but the collection itself. The collection is primarily post-war, but it also includes colonial and pre-Columbian works. Right. So it's always about everything we do, whether it's exhibitions, programs, or the collection, which is at the core of the institution.
Well, great. Hold that thought. Madeleine Grynsztejn. You're next, and you're also, you've been a couple of years in your museum, but you're the Pritzker director at the MCA in Chicago since 2008, so your office is fully unpacked.
It is.
And messy.
Very.
Yeah. And prior to coming into this role, she was a curator par excellence. Did wonderful shows, a lot of San Francisco. She did Carnegie in 1999-2000, wonderful, great exhibitions, also a real scholar, a writer like everybody on this panel, writes actively about her artists, and interestingly, we have an extremely diverse panel here today. You were born in Lima and raised in Caracas, and here you are. So here's your mission statement. Refreshingly short. The MCA Chicago is a top 21st century contemporary art museum, an artist-activated, audience-engaged platform for producing art ideas, community, and conversation around the creative process in order to be a consciousness leader of local necessity and international distinction.
That's right.
This was written under you?
Yeah.
Great. So we can hold you to it.
Absolutely.
Right. So what's your...
And my trustees, which a number of them are in the room.
Who also start the day by reciting the mission statement every day. So tell me, what's your sort of focal concern as you think about the evolution?
Well, that mission statement is a mouthful, but it can be parsed out into the things that we believe in and that we actually actively use. It's not only a vision statement, it's at the horizon and eventual manifestation of what we want the MCA to be. It's also the way that the way by which we decide what we do, and just as importantly, what we don't do. So when we say that we're a top 21st century art museum, we're really talking about excellence. And granted, that may be subjective, but I think that there's a certain consensus around what that means. And when we're talking about an artist-activated, audience-engaged process, platform, and product, we're talking about the fact that we want that to be 50-50, that cumulatively we want to focus as much as on what the artist is doing as on what the audience is doing. Now that is a shift from the DNA of the MCA, which was founded in 1967 as a Kunsthalle. We stole the model from Switzerland, brought it over to Chicago. We were among the first. And at that time, it was absolutely artist-centered and very, very much committed to the catalyzing of new work. And if an audience member walked in 1967 into an Alan Capro happening and didn't get it, we didn't care. And now you fast forward 40 years, and that core of what we do is still there. We still, at the core, is art. It's commissioning, it's invention, it's catalyzing, and it's interpretation. But now, as important to us, is making sure that we have, that we make sure that the audience accesses it at every level, including whether it's an iPod or whether it's a wall text or whether it's the web, which is particularly and increasingly more interesting and more important because it's actually now the first portal through which most of our audiences reach our museums. And we better get on board with that fact and the fact that our audiences, in many cases in our museums, are larger on the web than they are in real space. And when we say platform for the production of art, ideas, community, and conversation, again, art is at the core, but we are taking an increasingly what I call civic turn. We're increasingly committing ourselves to becoming a space where discussion and conversation can happen and must happen. And that's a reflection of reality. Our audiences are increasingly demanding co-authorship and increasingly demanding interaction. And if we don't create platforms for us to have a real dialogue as opposed to an authoritative canonic source at the top of the hill, we're also going to lose our way.
And that's a really important subject. Again, hold that thought. This issue of dialogue. If you're a sort of masochist and read a lot of audience-related and museum-related sort of policy studies, then this is the subject you constantly see, but easier said than done. And by the way, I just wanted to ask you, as a curator, it says you say artist-activated, audience-engaged. Where's the curator?
Oh, the curator's the connective tissue between the two. Absolutely the connective tissue between the two.
So the curator is balancing all this access and excellence.
They broker that conversation between the two.
So we'll get back to that. Thelma Golden, probably somebody who doesn't need an introduction, but let me say that she is Director and Chief Curator since 2005 at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she in fact began her career almost as an intern, if not as an intern. As an intern. In 1987, before she was recruited to the Whitney Museum, where she organized many, many, many groundbreaking exhibitions, including, of course, a biennial, the Black Male Show. You also ran the Philip Morris branch at the Whitney, and then went back in 2000 to the Studio Museum, first as Deputy Director, and then now as Director. And as Director, of course, you mounted a series of influential and controversial exhibitions in a highly charged space. It should meant to be highly charged space. And is clearly one of the leading influential voices in the art world today. Here is your mission statement, which you did or did not write.
Partially wrote.
Tweaked, which you tweaked.
Tweaked.
Yeah. The Studio Museum in Harlem is the nexus for artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally, and for work that has been inspired and influenced by Black culture. It is a site for the dynamic exchange of ideas about art and society. Another refreshingly short, not even 4-line mission statement. So what's top of mind for you?
Well, top of mind in that mission statement, which was really written by Lowry Stokes Sims, who was the director at the Studio Museum, who came in 2000, and I was her deputy director. And Lowry really initiated the process of looking at that mission and rewriting it to really express what was at that time a desire for our work and our mission to reflect what was the incredible possibility of change and transformation in the idea of what cultural specificity means. So that we inherited a mission that was about museums that came out of the late 60s, that looked at themselves as institutions that were fighting the art world for inclusion, for a seat at the table. And we wanted a mission that would further that mission, keep at core that sort of radical sense of institution building and changing, but also to reflect the world that we were living in. In some ways, though, you know, our name, the founders of the Studio Museum were incredibly brilliant, because really our name is our mission. You know, the studio in our name comes from the fact that we have studios. We are artist center, have always been. There's no way around thinking about us without the studio. Museum was very important. We were not founded, even though at the moment we could have been as a Kunsthalle, a non-collecting institution, but as a museum, because of what that represented and what it represented as it related to artists of color. And the Harlem, critically important. You know, we are institutionally site-specific, incredibly so. So the mission as written and our name together really are about this idea of an institution that can be artist-centered, audience-responsive, but also site-specific.
But, you know, institutions do sort of have a sort of tendency to build walls around themselves, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's just, that's what they create structures, they have protocols, they have committees. Can you say a specific thing about how you keep those boundaries porous, how you keep it artist focused, how you make sure that this absorption of what artists are doing really happens vis-a-vis perhaps what often is a more confrontational sense, that artists are sort of over here and museums are up here and there's a tension?
Well, I mean, I think, András, those tensions are there if it's inherent in how the institution has been constructed. But if you can imagine, I mean, the first program of the Studio Museum was the studio program. Our original space was a loft on 5th Avenue and 125th Street, and the museum, the gallery, was the front, the studios were the back, and so porous, it was porous, okay? I mean, literally. And that remains. I mean, it really remains at the core of what a museum like ours can be. Now, some of that comes from scale. Being small means we can be nimble, we can be reactive and responsive, but it also means that it creates an experience of the museum that is different. And for an institution like the Studio Museum, so deeply concerned with the idea of audience, right? How we speak to audience, how we create audiences, that's also what makes that possible.
Right. So that, thank you. That porosity, I think, is very much the guiding philosophy of Beatrix's institution in the Kunsthalle Zurich, which, well, actually, you know, all of these institutions are doing really well. I mean, they all either have recently built or are now building new facilities. There's a lot of attention. They are really at the very heart of their sort of respective creative networks and scenes. Beatrix Ruf has been the director and curator of the Kunsthalle Zurich for a decade. She is also one of the sort of great, well-known peripatetic figures of the international art scene. You cannot go to an international art event without seeing Beatrix there. I challenge you, you can be in Abu Dhabi, in Turkey. She's going to pop up in the same black shirt. She's going to be there. I mean, not the same, but
Not the same one.
And the reason is obvious. She is one of the leading curators and thinkers about art today. She's also co-curated the Yokohama Triennial, the Lyon Biennial, the Tate. She sat on all of the major prize committees you can imagine, and if you put together her essays and exhibitions, you really would have a sort of who's who of contemporary art, many of whom you can see behind me at the fair. Your mission, you're a slightly different institution. You know, in the US, we polish these missions like the family jewels. It's a little different in Europe, but let me read the Kunsthalle's case statement. The Kunsthalle institution format, formed in the late 19th century and 20th century, mostly by artists and the progressive patrons of art, takes a very specific position in the organism of institutions as a place and space for continued discourse, change, and progression according to the models of artistic practice and a free zone for the missing links in the institutional system. A free zone for missing links in the institutional system. Nicely put. Continuous insistence on autonomy, independence, and flexibility to change and adaptation to societal needs is one of the great qualities to be sustained for art and artists. So, Beatrix, tell us what you're thinking, and you literally are rebuilding your institution. So what is your evolutionary concern?
So, as you rightly said, at the moment we're in the total opposite. We're in early Baroque houses, which is a totally different way of producing shows, and it's a very interesting process. It was a long process, and as you can hear from it's not the mission statement. Our mission statement is very easy, artist activated, of course, and there is actually not much institutional construction around the actual activities, which is to enable artists to not only present but also formulate how art is thought in the times, and also how it communicates with the world. And of course, the Kunsthalle Zurich is a very strange organism, because most of those institutions, and they were mainly artist foundations or foundations in communication of artists and patrons, or like an interested and really engaged bourgeoisie at that time. Where in the late 19th and the early 20th century, Zurich has a very particular position, because everything in Zurich only started in the late 80s, which is very strange. The Kunsthalle is kind of a spin-off of the Kunsthaus Zurich, because there was the need and the desire to have a space which is the studio, the extended studio. The same story as ever. It was about real estate and art going somewhere, and that not being able to stay there when the real estate kicks in. And luckily, we found like a partnership with the city to buy that building. A very crucial moment, and this goes back to the mission. An idea was then, of course, to think, what does that really mean to not only grow that institution into the next step, but also maintain the incredible qualities the Kunsthalle type of institutions have. And it again was about the blind spots, or the missing parts. And in that years, I've been working there with. I'm very lucky to work with the most interesting artists. I consider most interesting was to find out that there's particular things Kunsthalles or the Kunstvereins also rarely do, due to funding problems, due to a continued existential endangerment, because it's not only that there is always very low money levels, but there's also with all the change of the intentions of museums, and also the bigger flexibility of museums, and the ideas of bringing contemporary art, which of course is always like the sake of museums to collect in a very early state, but also museums integrated more programs in contemporary art in their daily practice, like exhibitions, not only programs. And the question really was, what is that thing? You know, what is a Kunsthalle, and what is the real role a Kunsthalle can play in an institutional context, in the institutional context also of a city, but also which role can it play for the artists? And then of course the whole idea of not only growing, getting the institution more adult and getting its own space, and staying there and claiming continuity. The question was also how to extend and how to specify the activities of a Kunsthalle, of an institution which only builds up a virtual archive and not a physical archive like a museum. So many things we are getting in the future are about what you call dialogue and an activation of the authorship also of the audience. And what we of course are always, besides of being just walls and open to the definition of the artists themselves, how an exhibition is constructed, what an exhibition means. Often the exhibitions that are being realized at Kunsthalle are artworks themselves, because they are so fully conceived as a construct and as a combination of works by the artists, that I consider them mostly artworks themselves. But what we also started is to really engage much more in so-called the future audiences, and we did some really weird, for a Kunsthalle, weird elements, like we're actually having about 50 special events for children and for young adults, which is totally not done at Kunsthalles usually. And we have a program strand which is additional to the exhibition program, and we will even further that in the future to have programming of content, of discourse, as something which is not only let's say an interpretation of the shows, but like an individual program adding up to the institutional activity.
There's one more thing. You used the word archive there for a second. Can you just for 2 seconds tell us what you meant by that? The museum as an archive.
I mean, it's an archive. It's a memory. You all have you have a collection too, Thelma, and of course it changes the activity of an institution if you have to take care of the physical presence of artworks, and it creates an it needs a structure. It needs institutional structure for that. And a Kunsthalle is, I believe, and many times people ask me, why don't you collect, or why don't you change the Kunsthalle to a collecting institution? And I think it's really crucial. And I mentioned the museums and the extended activity of museums. The future, I think actually it is absolutely crucial to keep the Kunsthalle space and place free from the collection, from the physical collection. But of course the series of shows and the collaboration with artists and the transformation of the institution through the artistic visions is an archive too, but it's a virtual archive. It's an archive of memories and images. Yeah.
So we can all go home now. No, I mean, I think we succeeded in putting some broad brushstrokes on the sort of canvas that we're creating here. And many big themes have been mentioned. We talked about how do you incorporate outsider voices. We talked about the issue of access and what that means. The issue of the museum as a platform for dialogue, as a museum as filling these interstitial spaces and keeping some kind of freedom and autonomy. But I think that what I'd like to do is really now get into specific aspects of this problem, because, I mean, the first question really has to do with how do you balance all of this stuff? It seems like it's a lot, but we'll try to answer that at the end. But let me go straight to the issue which I think is really at the heart of this, and which really kept coming through in all of your comments, and this sort of changing relationship to the audience. I think you all seem to be struggling with this issue of an institution that had been created as a kind of bastion of authority, even though your respective institutions are particular takes on that idea. And you're all sort of working on opening these institutions, and you know, that's not an easy thing to do, partly because we've spent sort of 200 years making the audience into a kind of passive audience. You know, you can come in and hear these shiny objects in glass vitrines and stay quiet and then go home, but it has not been a very interactive experience. So how do you go? And it's a huge cultural imperative, because everything in society is becoming interactive and transparent. How do you create this dynamic relationship? And I'd like to ask you to say something specific steps that you can take, because it's easy to say in the abstract that we're going to make this into a dynamic, accessible institution. But what specifically can you do to break down those barriers? Yes?
Well, I think for some of us, it means not charging admission. Simple. For some of us, it means getting to a place where there is no barrier to entry.
Who here charges admission?
But we're free,
We're free most of the time.
Right,
one day a
different-
week, and 60% of our audience comes on that day.
And
yeah.
same with me.
And
70%.
the other hurdle clearer is that if you don't want to come in at all, that's okay, we'll come to you. So we have a plaza that we are now, we inaugurated this year an exhibition series on the plaza, where we take one of our billboards that's on the plaza that usually advertises the exhibition inside, and we changed it into a gigantic exhibition label with QR codes. So you can come 24/7 to our plaza, and you can see the Mark Hanforth exhibition, which was this summer. So lowering entry hurdles is absolutely top of mind. And what keeps us constantly, the conversation that we're constantly having is, how do you retain expertise and release control? Because nobody wants an uncurated museum, not the public and not the curators.
Okay, free ticket sounds good, but that's got to be not the end of the story.
No. I mean,
Margarita.
We think of our artists as educators. And the S-Files is one of the main platforms that our artists really educate the public. Exactly, we have free access to all our public programs, our symposium. Every public program that we do has free access as well. And we think of ourselves as educators as well. So in the S-Files, which is one of our more successful biennials, all our artists become educators.
The artist, not the museum, but
the museum is an educator, but the artists themselves are educators, and that's how we think.
Is anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you were saying that you mentioned earlier that we're dealing with a relatively passive audience, and I think it's worth, and we all know this, I think it's worth our remembering that it wasn't ever thus. That actually that audience, this audience, the way this is structured, where we're lit up and they're not, this is only 170 years old. This happened at the end of the 19th century when two guys in some theater in Paris figured out how to divide electricity into two different systems so that we're in the light and they're in the dark. And all of a sudden, audiences who had been active since the time of Athens went quiet, and so-called high art moments started to happen where audiences were passive. So just as technology then created this new audience, technology now, YouTube and Facebook and Twittering and everything, can help us flip that around, and we need to embrace that.
Very true, and I think you say we need to embrace that, says this work is still ahead. Why have museums taken so long? I mean, now...
Because we don't have any money.
Yeah.
That's
That's the only reason.
So the tools are there, so you're just waiting for...
Well, I'm not sure
Are
if
they?
the tools are there and we don't have any money, that's true.
Yeah.
But I also think that some in our field, I mean not us, some in our field have been resistant to these tools.
Because of the object premise.
Right.
And we're not dissing the object.
Exactly. So I think there's still, this sensibility that to engage these tools fully will somehow fundamentally change this relationship to the object and to viewing, and that's also why.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to talk, and in fact I say let's talk about digital, but before we talk about it, I wonder if we're sort of kicking the can down the road when we say, well, we haven't been good at this, but once we have our great website, suddenly the doors of access will fling open, and let's stop short of technology. Maybe there are other things that might turn audiences away. Is there something about the way museums present themselves to audiences? Whether it's the building, whether it's the comportment of the staff, that you feel might be part of this?
Well, sure, but I think, you're talking to 4 people at least who I think have significantly, in both broad and subtle ways, sort of tweaked that kind of experience. I work in a museum, in a community where direct engagement is a norm, right? So, I have a security staff that are used to the idea that they are going to be in dialogue Right?
Well, let
if
me ask you
someone
this,
speaks to you, you're going to speak to them. There
Right.
isn't this sort of distant, silent, sort of, guardianship sort of role. So I think that, yes, in the broad way that you're talking about it, there are other things that can be done, but I think if you look closely, you will see a much more important way that institutions are changing some of these codes and changing the way in which things happen.
Yeah, and also what you both mentioned actually is it's about attitude,
Right.
deeply
Yeah.
about attitude and transparency. And if you, I mean, no, everybody wants a curated museum, but the attitude, how you transmit that to an audience, and it's like hosting at your house. You, some houses you don't like to go to, some houses you feel home. And I think it is about combining expertise with, as Suzanne Paget would say, elitarism for the crowd, and in a very, very personal way. And I think it is about attitude, and it's about transparency of making your own processes and also your own question accessible.
That's
in a
really
way.
It's about
critical, the
empowering your
visibility
staff.
factor.
Because
Sorry?
it's about empowering everyone and your staff. Because I tell everybody in the staff, you are a museum professional. Whether you're in the cafe, whether you're a guard, whether you're in visitor service, you are the face of this museum every time a person comes in. And I think it's about engagement. It's about, if you have a story, you tell it. We trained everybody to know what we have in our collections, in our exhibitions. So it is about reaching that audience, and it is a training. It is an idea that you want to make sure that gets out there.
I think for all of us, I think what we're saying is that the touch point doesn't begin inside the gallery after
Exactly.
you've paid admission. The touch point, and my experience with Museo del Barrio is like that. The touch point begins when you pick up the phone or when you put your hand on the handle of that door.
A friend of mine told me a very interesting story the other day. He went in a taxi cab with someone, a driver who was very new to this country, only a few months. And when he got out of the cab, he asked the driver, "Do you go into this museum?" And the driver said, No, I would never go into this museum. And then he asked him, "Would you go into a library?" And he said, "Oh, all the time we go to the library." So and he asked, I think, a wonderful question about how did this guy in 4 months figure out that he's not invited to the museum, but he is invited to the library? Oops, sorry.
Right.
So that there must be something, some body language, that already happens before you even enter the space of the
Well, there's
institution.
the architecture. In some cases, you inherit architecture that that might be for some off-putting, and then you jujitsu that. You change the terms, but that's changing too. I mean, even architecturally, we're moving from the 90s Bilbao to the Hirschhorn balloon pavilion. And the Tate expansion. We're moving towards spaces of engagement, even architecturally, in terms of our museum practice. So, where dialogue is not on the margins, it's really in the center of things.
Well, speaking of Tate, I want to move on because our time is limited. Collections,
Yeah.
right? Not your problem. But collections. Obviously, they're the name of the game for most museums. But they also come with strings attached. When we were talking in June, Chris Dercon from the Tate Modern was on my panel, and he made a rather startling assertion. He said maybe museums should focus less on collecting and focus more on being community institutions. What do you make of that?
What? Oh, you
you
disagree?
go ahead.
I'll agree. Well, we can do point of count. Do
Okay.
you disagree? Go ahead.
Perfect, I'll leave.
I don't so much disagree as that I think that what's happened, the way I would like to think about it is that vis-a-vis collections, we should be judged by the consequences of our use of the collection rather than by how it's sitting there or what its provenance is. I think it's a use factor. I would never give up on a collection. I love it because it's a kind of central DNA, and it's one of the ways in which you can distinguish yourself. But you have to be judged by the consequences of how you use your stuff. Now, not property per se. And museums themselves, again, I think happily, there's a kind of reign of terror of conservators, and now more and more, even great important museums and really important museum groups are starting to think about lowering standards of conservation and saving on some carbon footprint. And that means that you can open up some windows and literally start to let the world in. Part of the reason the taxi driver doesn't want to go there is because the place is literally lightless. And I think letting light in is important materially, symbolically.
I'm not sure I agree with him fully. I do think that collections are important for us now to ensure the future of our institutions, right? So the collection of the Studio Museum tells an important history, and I feel we continue to collect to shape how that history will be understood in the future. I do think, however, we have to think differently about the sort of acquisitive process of amassing. Right? I think there's a certain kind of collecting principle that's, about the big grab, and I think we need to be more strategic in thinking about how we collect.
So give me an example, a specific example of how you can be more strategic.
Well, I think at the Studio Museum in Harlem, we think about, with an individual artist, what other works are in New York City. Right? So that idea of having this kind of institutional desire to always...
Everybody with their own bag of marbles.
To always claim the same things, but to think about it in a wider way. And in many cases, there are strategic decisions we've made around artists that are based on the amazing holdings in other places, so that then that artist in total is represented well, as opposed to we all have to have this one particular thing by a particular artist.
And what Dirkon was saying is that there's a lot of replication. Everybody has one of each.
Right.
For us, the collection is actually tells a story. It will tell a story now, and it will tell a story in the future. But it's also making the collection accessible. It's really important and vital, not just in the web or any other space, but actually making it accessible. What we're actually studying is our next vision for the collection, which is Visiones 2020, which will allow access to the collection objects by creating perhaps even a fellowship for a registrar, by educating people in the collection, by having the collection permanently shown on a rotating basis because of space. We are constrained, as Studio and other institutions are, but constantly having it at the forefront. It is at the core, but also making it available in other ways. As I said, making it available in a workshop where we can train registrars, where they can have access. And that's why that collection is important, because it teaches that history. It just is another teaching tool.
Did you have a thought?
I do think about collection a lot.
There's an interesting model, though, happening in your neighborhood, which I'm interested in following, which is this, it's called L'International. And the Reina Sofia, MUCA Antwerp, I think the Contemporary Museum in Zagreb and Eindhoven are pulling their resources of collections and archives together to create a sort of gigantic mega collection that all of them can borrow from and make exhibitions around, focused on 1960s and 70s conceptual art. I'm super interested in seeing how that works out.
You think that could happen here?
I'd love to see it happen in the United States.
You think realistically it could happen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It takes trust, and it takes right-sized. It takes the fact that every player needs to be the same size.
Or at vastly different sizes.
Or vastly different sizes.
Yeah, totally agree. And also it goes back to the idea of the library also.
Exactly.
The libraries are connected.
Now, if you look at this in this ecological way, which is not just my fortress and your fortress and her fortress, then of course there's the whole other side of the fence right behind me, which is the whole commercial art world and collectors and vast amounts of material that's already sitting out there in semi-accessible form. I'm sure everybody here did their Stages of the Cross yesterday at the Margulies collection, and so if you did, I think everybody here is probably interested in this since you're all here at a commercial art fair. Is there some way to deepen that relationship with the private side of things? Is there something that can be generated from that relationship beyond we would like to have your gifts, please, that could help you advance your missions? In other words, it still remains two very discrete fields. There's a lot of opacity about where the relationship happens and how. How can you deepen that relationship with the market, with private collectors in ways that benefit the missions of museums?
Well, I think in some ways, what you're pointing to, actually artists often make that happen, right? Because the artist is sort of the one who's at the center of those things, right? They're at the center of the nonprofit institutions that present them and show them and perhaps collect them, the private collectors, and of course their commercial representation. So often those partnerships are created through the artists, right? We all are committed to the artists in some way, and we might participate in that commitment at different points, and hopefully ultimately some manifestation of that will end up in a public collection. But I think this really is where artists' role between all of us really activates those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. We have stressed for time, but I do want, there's two questions that I have to ask you. One is going back to digital. So the hard lesson learned for the media industry, which was sort of the first one to really have to embrace digital media, was that you're not just creating a kind of carbon copy of who you are actually redesigning who you are. That is, that the only way to go digital is to completely rethink what it means to be a newspaper or magazine. Is that a lesson that museums are prepared to embrace? That it's not simply, okay, here's my website, now you can do what you always did, but now on the website. That it will change your business model, if you will. It will change your fundamental operating model. Is that something that museums are ready to fully acknowledge?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, well, let's put it this way. A newspaper today looks extremely different from what it did 15, 20 years ago. Editors, no feedback, no role for the audience. Today you have half the content on even the New York Times website is written by people outside. Is that something is that a place where museums are really going?
I think, it provides for incredible and vital engagement, much more so. And I think it'll provide other platforms for us to create even bigger and more ambitious things to put on a website, let's say. Not just lesson plans, not just the collection, but you can put symposiums on the website. You can think of so many things, but it'll allow for anything for much more engagement on a larger.
Yeah, but I think it's we should not confuse the tool and the instrument. I mean, for us it's tools, and I think it's crucial and important that that museums and institutions are connecting with the same tools everybody's using on the, like the permanent transport on your iPhone or but all the tools this technology is blank. But I don't think it changes, let's say, the design of publishing maybe, but I think the institution is using it as a tool.
Well,
and we definitely should, no?
I think Beatrix makes a really important distinction between the tool and the use, because I think that we will use the technology, but I think all of us will turn to artists for how to use them, and will be artist driven in that. And I also think there's a big difference between information and knowledge, and I think we're about knowledge, and I think that we must retain a stance, a point of view, even as we make room and embrace the divergent opinions of others.
So for example, it's not going to be a means for the audience to have a say in acquisitions policy or curatorial decision making or scholarly reflection.
I think
that you're going to stop short of that. I'm trying to be provocative.
I don't think it's stopping short of anything. I think it's just a different. You want to provide a democratic platform, but obviously there are decisions that a museum has to make, that curators have to make.
Right.
That is guided totally by that mission and the vision of that institution or space.
And it also depends on what we're talking about. It depends on the project. There's so many pieces in there that I think I think all of us are willing to say, yes, we are willing to sort of open some of this up and create more democratic spaces. But the question becomes how we do that in a way that's even interesting. I'm not sure it's that interesting to just say we're opening it up for the sake of it, but to see ways in which that could be really profound in terms of the way in which our audience engages with our institutions, our collections, and we engage with our audiences.
Now, speaking of audience engagement, how many people might have a question? Okay. Then I'm going to ask one question, and then we'll get to audience questions. As you look out and you think about the evolution of your museums, and you look at other industries, education, science, medicine, media, whatever, do you see any models? Do you see any ways of kind of in a way encountering similar challenges of today's world that you see other types of institutions address in ways that may be beneficial to the museum world? Are you looking at certain companies or entrepreneurs or institutions that say, aha, they got it, maybe this is something we should do?
I think we take things at different levels from all of those places, really. Working on a street like 125th Street, it's hard not to sort of look at, different models of engagement that come in a street like that. Sort of the models of the way in which civic engagement can play out in these kind of big, broad institutions. And I think that we all probably look in different ways at parts of other industries, but I'm not sure I can say there's one that would be the model. I think the model is a new idea. I think we're all involved in this idea of how we can change the paradigm for museums, in and of themselves.
Comes from any areas. Innovation comes from just about anyone.
I mean, we look to wherever there's meaning making. It's wherever consciousness is raised. That's a place that we look.
Hands up. There's a lady in the front row. If you could state your name, please, and just know that your comments are on the public record because Art Basel tapes these interviews.
Hi, my name is Camila Chavez Cortez, and I'm an artist, a photographer, and a painter, and also I'm doing some articles for Latin America. And I'm very concerned about, in an age where museums are privatized, their names are changed, how can people actually be able to access collections in a transparent fashion?
Who would like to?
How do you mean access collections? I mean, have
any collection. A museum might have a collection of photographs or paintings that depict certain times and certain age, and might have certain, pieces that some people would never like to see, while others would love to see. And how can that be managed really transparent in an age where everything has been privatized?
Well, museums don't have their collections all the time on view, and certain holdings are not on view, not necessarily. It could be because there is no exhibition, it could be because the materials are not being presented for some reason, conservation being one of them. So access depends on whether a scholar is requesting access to it or a private individual, but access is always something that a museum can make available to its public by a mere appointment.
There's another lady in the front row.
Hi, my name is Rosita Todorova, and I'm a graduate student, and I have a similar question, which is, for people that don't have access to New York, how are you specifically working to give access to the entire country for your organizations, including having access to those private collections? And maybe the true question as a student is, what are you specifically doing to put all the images online?
It comes back to money.
It is more expensive than
to
put everything online. Hugely expensive. We would love to do it, but work your way backwards from that. It means pulling the object out of storage. It means photographing the object. It means confirm. So there's preparators, there's photographers, there's researchers to reconfirm the tombstone information and provenance. Then you've got to put it on the web, so there's the web guy, then et cetera, et cetera. And that's actually an additional entire stream, which all of us are slowly adding to our workforce.
Yeah.
But it's, and we believe we want to do it. At the same time, I think that digitizing the entire collection is not necessarily maybe the most productive place for us to go.
Exactly.
You know, like, do you really want to see the stuff I
She
wouldn't
does.
put out? Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it comes back in a way to what you said about information and knowledge.
Right.
When we're
There's a
talking about
difference.
visual art, whatever it is, you know, it can be from a thought to a massive sculpture. But I think there is a reason why it's visual arts, and it has to be experienced. So this openness or this transparency of giving access to what's in the collection, what's been done in institution, only can stay on the level of information, but
And,
not beyond.
Traditionally, we publish catalogs, we publish pamphlets, we make things available in more traditional ways, so we have access that way. For every major exhibition, and even exhibitions that are not that, that are smaller in scope, most of us publish some sort of information about those projects and exhibitions.
But I think to the other part of your question is how people who are not in New York can have access to our institutions and our program. That is where the web is a great tool. And I think for us at the Studio Museum, where we see an important part of our platform as being advocacy about artists of African descent, that our website points you to not just our program, but the presence of artists of African descent everywhere. So whether it's in other exhibitions, Madeleine has a fantastic exhibition that just opened that we have on our site as a way to offer the possibility of the experience of our broader mission, not just what happens in our walls, but what happens all
Everywhere
over.
else.
But she did ask, another component of her question was this international global role. I mean, you're all in the same fix to some extent. You're local institutions that suddenly are operating in a global environment. And of course, luckily you have the web, and that provides a partial answer to how do you make your works accessible on a global level. But aren't there deeper and more profound ways that this identification of the museum as a global museum impacts what you do, the choices you make, beyond the digital? Can perhaps one of you address that issue of?
Well,
It's
go ahead.
it's inherent in our programs. I mean, our programs are ultimately international. I mean, I love the idea that the way we work is hyper-local. I mean, I love the fact that, my universe is about 5 blocks, right?
Yeah.
There's a fantastic Entezaki Shanghai line in her play for colored girls. I used to live in the world, and now I live in Harlem, right? About, the shrinking of one's universe. And so, the hyper-local provides, an incredible experience around an art institution. But then, programmatically, what we all now engage in is an incredibly international program that allows for the international and the global to come into the local, but also to be informed very much by the place that we're in. And that's the real experience of our institution and the experience that one can also get on the web.
The same happens in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
and Zurich.
Yeah.
I operate
that's
very,
it.
very much out of that. If we, to circle back to the vision statement, it ends with, in order to be
International significance.
of local necessity and international significance. And I believe utterly that it's the former that leads to the latter.
Yeah.
That as big and central as the Tate Turbine Hall and everything is in London, in a very big city, the reason I think why it is the most attended museum in the world is because there's a kind of local grab there that is very, very intense. And it is utterly, utterly central to us that we be locally necessary first, and that is what leads to being internationally distinctive.
I mean, for
That
me,
is a function of being internationally distinctive.
Beatrix, you were
Totally
nodding in agreement. Yes.
Hello, my name is Monty Harris. I'm a beauty, health, and identity surgeon. And I had an interesting question for Ms. Golden related to this concept of site specificity and cultural sensitivity. And as we look at neighborhoods and communities becoming mosaics of multicultural phenomena, and with the root of sort of like the Studio Museum in Harlem having sort of this African diaspora root, how do that sort of merger of site specificity and cultural sensitivity evolve when neighborhoods are changing?
Well, that's why, I have really embraced this idea of site specificity, because as the neighborhood changes, it's important that in some ways, even though by nature as a museum we want to be constantly evolving, that we fix certain things, right? And that fixing is what allows for the experience of the history of Harlem, of this neighborhood, of its cultural history, to always be present no matter what happens around us. Mm-hmm. So it's a way, at one hand, of staying, the same and changing in the same way, but I think it's also this sensitivity, right? And being a space that exists to also provide a space of dialogue about art and culture in ways that, while this change is happening, that the museum can play an active role in helping to broker and negotiate the change, the old and the new, the sense of ownership and that sense of sort of visitorship, and I think that's where also, as an institution, we have an amazing, it's a real privilege, and it's also a real possibility.
Mm-hmm.
We should choose people from this part of the house because we want to be fair. And yes. Oh, hello.
Hello. My name is Michela Bondardo. I'm Italian, and I have a difficult question that comes from the interesting story that happened at the MoCA a few days ago with Marina Abramovic that we all know. Mm-hmm. So and I've been on the side of the museums for many years. So how we can save our mission and our, good intentions from the greedy of the, sometimes of the donors and the need for money. So how to balance the need of money, which is about economy. We didn't speak about economy now, but probably this subject that is very important. And these, and we know it is more, we are here in Art Basel, the powerful weight of donors, collectors, and money. Mm-hmm.
Who would like to take that
I know that it is a difficult
question?
And it is about good intentions, of course. But I see that it is the balance is getting more and more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, may I just start with saying, it's of course money is the problem always.
We mentioned money and the lights go down.
Yes, immediately go down. And particularly in contemporary art, I feel, because it's because there's a labeling process for many, like, let's say companies or stacks companies might have in sponsoring. It's about labels, and contemporary art intentionally, of course, decodes and deconstructs labels, and therefore it's more difficult. But I do also think that it's very, very crucial to look at the context, in which context institutions are struggling with the money and what the cultural construction is. And I mean, in Switzerland, for example, most of the institutions are private foundations, and over the time got into public subsidies, but still there's 60 to 70, sometimes even more private funding necessarily. But it does need, there's even a difference between Zurich and Basel. So I think it's very crucial to look at what the history of the very particular cultural context and construction, and also engagement, and I think it is again also about demeaning the society, the local, the society gave to it, and you have to work from there. So it's too one-dimensional to say, money is taking over. I think it's very much about site-specific here. I never say this word.
Site specificity.
Yes, site specificity.
We'll take one more question. Gentleman in the back, over there, white shirt. Can a microphone go there? And unfortunately, we'll only take one question. I'm sorry. Is there a microphone?
Hi, my name is
Sorry, it's a lady.
Maricela Lagrave. I'm a media artist based, New York based. I've been working with site-specific projects for about 10 years now, and I really have a question where, if everything is about money ultimately, which it is, it's about sustainability, well, not just about money, but how do you make it through whatever you have to make it through? The question here is, after what you have all been saying, what is the function of the museum in the future? You know, is the museum the place where, because public space have now obviously been of the property of corporate and something else I don't want to mention, but it's no longer the place for people to get together where, you know, in the classic Greek terms, they can do agora, which means to get together and converse and to understand the times they're living. So it's obviously that space have been hijacked for the people by whatever the forces that are not connected.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question a little bit, because it's actually similar to what I was going to ask you as my closing question. The ultimate purpose of the museum. Let me just, if you allow me, slightly reframe it. You are here as the main champions of your respective institutions and as important spokespeople for the museum world. If you had to make the case about why museums are indispensable in the next decade, in the next 50 years, to public officials, to funders, ultimately, what is it that you say, and what is the biggest adjustment that museums need to make in order to deliver on what you believe is that most important thing, based on everything that we've talked about today? And let's start with you, and then we'll just finish up.
I think museums teach and educate. Museums are relevant, and for me, the institution has a place in society through its programs, its exhibitions, and again, the mission that we serve. We train artists, we train art workers, so we have a reason to exist and to tell a story now and to tell a story in the future. The best way, I think you have to find out a balance, how your friends can help you. Make the institution financially sustainable. And there are many ways, and I don't want to get into them, but thinking of the future, how do you endow the museum so that your museum will sustain and live financially sound for the next 20, but the next 50 years as well. But those are the decisions you have to make now. And how to keep doing the same thing you're doing, but expanding it even more. That is at the core of what museums, at least my museum, needs to do. But we teach and we educate, and that's a major role that all museums, at least we do.
Thelma, how do you make the case? What is the big adjustment?
I think the way we make the case for museums is that we continue to speak about the important role that art objects, and most importantly, artists, have in shaping the public dialogue. How the space in which artists create through their work and the ideas in their work create an opportunity, and that our museums, in that support of those artists and in the preservation of these objects, provide a public space, as the question was framed to us, to continue to allow for that. How do we continue doing that in the future? Well, we continue to make these spaces responsive to those needs. And that does change because the needs of the audience change, the tools change. I also think we do it by claiming and being extremely, extremely focused on our place. And I mean that around this idea of this kind of site specificity. I think we have to exist not as part of our communities in some ways, but in them, deeply embedded, deeply part of the fabric of the place, however we define that, whether it's the one block or the whole city, but the place that we are in, to be then productive members of this very large and complex international cultural community.
Madeleine.
A couple of mantras. We create citizens, not consumers. And that's a big
good
thing.
One.
Okay? Art and museums have one great thing in common, the most important thing in common, which is they raise consciousness. And that's related. The third thing, which is that we are absolutely come out of artists, and Mark Bradford in his year-long residency with us, and Olafur Eliasson, who's sort of been my muse, for years, have say things like this. Mark said to us when he was in Chicago, and we said, how do we reach out to the community? He said, you're in the community. You are the community. You don't have to reach out to the community. You're part and parcel of this space. And Olafur often talks about how the museum is a way to get further into society. It might have been, when it first came up in the 19th century and even before, a place to get away from society, to sort of meditate. Now it's a way to dive more deeply into society. And that is related to this issue of the agora. And there's a paradox right now in our world, which is that museums and contemporary art have never been more popular or more visible. You know, there's a tremendous amount of attention. You know, there's curators in soap operas.
Yeah.
There's reality TV. There's Bravo work of art. I mean, and yet, behind closed doors, we're talking about an issue of relevance. And that has to do with a bigger problem than us. That has to do with the fact that the loss of civic dialogue and the loss of consensus in the public sphere, which has to do with a kind of breakup ideologically among our society into micro communities of interest. It has to do with lack of education. It has to do with an anti-intellectualism that we've inherited in the American DNA, for one thing. All of that is working against us. So what does a museum need to be most of all? It needs to be that space. Granted, it is infused with the market, and so it should be. It is not separate from society, but it needs to be that space that allows just a little bit of room for a little bit of time to talk about what is separate from commerce, and to just open up a little bit of space to be a citizen and not a consumer.
Beatrix. That was good.
As Amrita would say, all of the above. All of the above. There's a very famous writer who said, everything has to change to stay the same. And I think we should actually do the opposite. Yeah. We should stay the same, actually, to change a lot. And I really do think that this insistence to open that gap, the little thing, to talk about knowledge and not information, to also take that language serious, which has been developed by the artists, is a crucial point, and it's about negotiating the public and the private continuously as a public endeavor. So.
Well, thank you very much. Enjoy the fair. Thank you.